Alright, class, does anyone know what the product rule is? Yes, Nick.
The product rule is f prime of x times g prime of x.
F prime of x times g prime of x. Are you sure?
I'm positive,
Is
Professor
that really
Dahl.
what you think? Well, you're wrong, and I'm going to show you why. Hello students, my name is Professor Dahl, and today I will be teaching you how to derive the product rule from the limit definition. So this is the definition of a limit, as we all know, and it's a pretty tricky thing, but we're going to simplify it a little bit. So first, you all understand that we're just taking the derivative of f of x, and this is how you do it. So if we want to find the product rule, it's f of x times g of x. So we're going to start out with that. So the derivative of f of x times g of x is equal to, and you always want to keep your notation because that's really important, the limit as h goes to 0 of f of x plus h times g of x plus h, and then we're going to leave a little blank spot here, but we'll fill that in later, and then we'll do this side of it, which is minus f of x times g of x. Alright, so in this, and it's all over h. So in this little blank spot right here, there's a special little thing that we can do. We can add something and subtract the same term because that's legal and it will help us a lot down the road. We're going to subtract f of x plus h times g of x. And then we are also going to add f of x plus h times g of x. Alright, so this is where we're starting. Alright, continuing. Now we are going to put it in terms of f of x plus h rather, and g of x. So in order to do this, we're going to always bring down the limit. This notation is very important. And then we are going to take out this f of x plus h right here to go f of x plus h times g of x plus h minus g of x over h. And we're going to add it. We're going to take this g of x and this g of x. So we're going to do g of x times f of x plus h minus f of x over h. Okay, so this is the next step. Alright, we are so close to finding the final answer. So now you're going to take the limit as h approaches 0 and apply it to all of these functions. So we're going to take the limit as h approaches 0 of f of x plus h. We're going to take the limit as h approaches 0 of g of x plus h minus g of x over h, and those are multiplied together, remember. Then we're going to add it. The limit as h approaches 0 of g of x, and then we're going to multiply it by the limit as h approaches 0 of f of x plus h minus f of x over h. Now this is truly special because when you look at this, and you look at this, and then you look at this, oh no! It's the derivative of the function, and that's the limit definition of a derivative, otherwise known as g prime of x, f prime of x. Okay, so we understand that, and now this just stays the same because it's the limit as h approaches 0, and there's no h in there, so it's just g of x times f of x. And then on this side, because h approaches 0, this h is going to equal 0, so we can just scribble it out. So now we just have f of x times g of x plus g of x times f prime of x, and g prime of x I should add. And that's, alright, so now we're just going to rewrite it so that you have it, and it's super easy, and we're going to use it for the rest of the video. So the derivative of f of x times g of x is going to equal f of x times g prime of x, that's the derivative of g of x, plus g of x times f prime of x, which is just the derivative of x. And this will all make more sense in the coming problem.
First, we're going to find the derivative of y equals sine of x times cosine of x. Now, as Professor Dahl just derived, we have the product rule. Y equals f prime of x times g of x plus g prime of x times f of x. Now we know that, so let's take what we have here and plug it in. So first, we can find f of x, which is, in this case, simply going to be sine. Now, we have to find the derivative of sine of x for f prime of x, which is obviously cosine. So g of x, as we already know, is the second part, is just going to be cosine. And lastly, obviously, if we use derivative rules again to find g prime of x, we're going to get negative sine. Now we have everything we need. We simply just have to plug it into the product rule that Professor Dahl showed us. So we're going to take y prime equals f prime of x. So as we know, that will be cosine of x, times g of x, which is also cosine of x. And we will add g prime of x, which is negative sine, times f of x, which obviously is sine. So this is essentially the derivative. We can take it a little bit further though, because obviously we have a cosine times a cosine here, and a negative sine times a sine there. So as our final answer, we can get y prime equals cosine squared of x minus sine squared of x. And that is how you use a combination of derivative rules and the product rules to find the answer. So, it's time to take it a step further from what Professor Dahl previously derived. Now, we have x cubed times sine of x, and we're going to find the derivative using the product rule like we previously discussed. However, there's going to be a couple other rules with this one too. We have to use the power rule to derive this, and we have to use the functions we already know with sine of x. So this is the one you should be getting more familiar with, the product rule. We're going to take what we know here and plug it in from the variables of this equation. So obviously, f prime of x times g of x plus g prime of x times f of x is going to get our derivative. So let's take what we know up here so we know what to plug in and just lay it all out before we start the problem. So f prime of x is going to be the first part of the equation, but it's going to be the derivative. So obviously x cubed, using the product rule, that's going to be 3x squared. F of x is obviously just x cubed. And then g of x obviously is sine of x. And lastly, using the rules you've memorized, if you take the derivative of sine of x, or g prime of x, you're going to get cosine of x. So now we have the layout here, and we just simply have to plug it in to find the derivative. So obviously, first we're going to take the f prime of x at the top, which is 3x squared. Multiply that by g of x, which is sine of x. And then we're going to add on the second part of the equation, starting with g prime of x, which is cosine of x. And lastly, the normal f of x, which is x cubed. So now we have our derivative, we just have to solve it. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to take the 3 and attach that to the sign to make things more simple for us. So then we're going to have 3 sine of x multiplied by the x cubed, or the x squared. We can add on the second part and just have it be x cubed times the cosine of x. And it's up to you how far you want to take this and simplify it, but we can do a couple more steps just to get the final form of the answer. So now, basically, what we're going to do is we're going to factor out this x squared from both sides of the equation. So we're going to have an x squared, then parentheses, and now that this is factored out of here, it's just simply going to be 3 sine without this x squared. And then, obviously, factoring out the x squared from the x cubed is just going to leave us with x. So that leaves us with this final answer, x squared times 3 sine of x plus x cosine of x.
Okay, so that we're going to take the derivative of this function now. And you're going to look at it and you're going to be like, oh no, Professor Dahl, this is really, really tricky. But we're going to show you that it's not as tricky as it seems. So first, when you're doing a big problem like this, you want to start with the quotient rule, which we already know. And it's f prime of x times g of x minus, and you have to make sure it's minus, g prime of x times f of x. And it's all over g of x squared. Okay, so to start this out, we are going to list, we're going to name these. This is going to be f of x, and this is going to be g of x. And we're just going to list out all the terms that we need to know. So f of x is just going to be x e to the x. F prime of x is, we're going to leave that blank because we're going to need to use the product rule for that. G of x is just going to be 1 plus x, and then g prime of x is going to be just 1. Okay, so now we're missing a term here, right? So we're going to need to use the product rule to find f prime of x. So f prime of x is the product rule, and we're going to start out with, we're going to do the derivative of x e to the x. And just like in the quotient rule, we still want to name all of our terms. So we're going to name this term as f of x, and this term as g of x. So now we're going to take f prime of x, which is just going to be 1, times e to the x, which is, or the derivative of g to the x, which is going to be e to the x. So it's 1 times e to the x. And then we're going to add it. We're going to add e to the x because that's g to the x. And then we're going to multiply it by x. Okay. So that is the product rule answer, but we can simplify it a lot. So we can take out the e to the x from both sides. So it's going to be e to the x times 1 plus x. And that we can put in right here because that is the derivative of f of x. Okay, and now all we need to do is just plug these into the quotient rule. Okay, so now that we've found the answer for f prime of x, we can just plug it all into the quotient rule. So the quotient rule, we're going to start out with f prime of x, which is this, what we just found. So it's going to be e to the x times 1 plus x. We're going to multiply it by g to the x, which is 1 plus x. And we're going to subtract it by g prime of x, which is just 1, so we don't even have to write it, times f of x, which is x e to the x. And then it's all over gx squared, which is 1 plus x squared. Okay, so this is our answer, but we can simplify it just a little bit more to make it look more pretty. So we're going to take the derivative is going to equal, these are the same and they're being multiplied by e to the x, so we can just square them. So it's e to the x times 1 plus x squared minus x e to the x over 1 plus x squared. And that's our answer. And you might be thinking like, oh, I can just cross these boys out, but you can't do that because it's not on this side, so just don't even think about it. Alright, so that's our final answer. Okay, so we've done some tricky problems so far, but this one's going to be really difficult. So in this one, we're going to use the product rule and the chain rule. So as we all know, the product rule is f prime of x times g of x plus g prime of x times f of x. And what I find really helpful in tricky problems like this is to label your functions f and g. So this function right here is g and this function right here is f. Alright, so the derivative of f of x is going to be 6x to the 5th, because we all know the power rule. And then it's just going to be g of x, which is sine cubed x. Okay. And then it's going to be plus g prime of x, which we're just going to write it as this for now. The derivative of sine cubed of x times f of x, which is just x to the 6th. Okay. Okay, so we're going to move this funky little function over here. And so the derivative of sine 3 of x is going to be the derivative of the outside function, which is going to be 3, and then we'll take the inside function, it stays the same, which is just sine of x squared. Okay, and then we do the derivative of the inside function, which is sine of x. The derivative of sine of x is cosine of x. And so that is using the chain rule to figure that out. And then we just plug that in right here. So our final answer is going to be 6x to the 5th times sine cubed of x plus 3 times sine of x squared times the cosine of x times this funky little x to the 6 right there. And that is your answer.